Like most South African Jewish families, our origins were mainly from Lithuania. About 2/3 of the South African Jews, I believe, had Lithuanian origins. In 1954, I'd been there a year or two in Cape Town at Goldschmidt's. They said to me, look, we have an office in Bulawayo, in Rhodesia. And they said, look, we want you to go and spend 3 months substituting for Wallerstein, who's going to see his sister. He hasn't seen her since before World War II. She lives in New York. So by this time, I'd met Val, and through Manfred Salomon, my lifelong friend, and we were having a very, very hot love affair. I didn't have a car, but my mother had a little Fiat, tiny Fiat. So I used to travel back and forth over this mountain pass, over Kloofneck mountain pass, and go and see Val in Claremont, where the college was. She was at Berkeley House Teachers Training College. And so we had this love affair. My parents loved her, by the way. They weren't in the least concerned that she wasn't technically Jewish. Her father was Jewish, but her mother was a Gentile and had become a Christian Scientist. Her mother came from an English background. So, but it didn't bother my parents or anybody else in the family. And but we'd arranged, when this offer came, or really instruction came for me to go to Bulawayo, we had to concentrate our minds. So we became engaged. And we were to get married in January 1956, 1st of January 1956. So Val's course at Berkeley House was a 3-year course, and the final year was going to be, was that year, 1955. So she was going to graduate in November or December, and then we were going to get married. Her father insisted on having the wedding in Bloemfontein, where she came from, in the middle of the country. So I went to Rhodesia. She started studying Hebrew and eventually got converted while I was away. That was her choice. That was entirely her choice. She came from a family where she had a number of cousins, Jewish cousins, on her father's side. Her father had a sister who had children. She was very close to Ethne Siegel and her brother, and there were other friends she was at school with, Shirley Light and so on. So she had mainly Jewish friends and many Jewish family. Her brother, on the other hand, when the mother died, because her mother died when Val was about 16. Mother was only 42. She had a heart problem, and she died. And soon after, Val was sent to Berkeley House. But her brother was sent to a boarding school, Kersney College boarding school. So he was brought up in a different way, and it was a Protestant school. I think it was a Methodist school. So he moved in that circle. He became a big yachtsman and an accountant, and eventually he landed up in Toronto, married, and he's got children and grandchildren. We were engaged. In those days, engagement was an official happening. We were engaged on the 1st of April, 1955. I had an engagement ring made and put in the date, Val, Geoff, April 1, 1955. And the way the engagements were announced, there was an entry in the Cape Town evening paper, the Cape Argus. Until the article appeared in the Cape Argus, you were not engaged. So that day, April the 1st, happened to be the day when the Cape Town Rag was on. The Rag was a celebration, a carnival. It was a big event in Cape Town, and there were floats traveling around the town. So Val had come in with a friend of hers on that day to see the Rag. She'd come in with a couple of girlfriends from the college. And she, of course, she couldn't wear the engagement dress. She had the engagement, but she couldn't wear it because the announcement had not yet appeared in the Cape Argus. She wasn't officially engaged. So she put the ring in her bag. So after the floats had gone by, she looked down and found that her bag was open. The ring was gone. We went to the police. And we said, look, this has happened. He says, look, you've got no hope. They've taken the diamond out and thrown the shank away. You'll never get it again. But you know what? You might put an ad in the paper. Somebody might be an informer, and you might well put an ad in the paper. So he said, by the way, what was the inscription? I must have that down for my... He said, April 1, 19... He said, but that's today. Val said, yes, and she started crying and praying. So anyway, we put an ad in the paper, and we offered a reward, and we got a call. And the police followed it up, and they recovered the ring. It was amazing. Somebody was an informer, informed on his pal or acquaintance, reported it to the police. The police, of course, it was tied up for months in the court case as evidence, but the ring was found. There was the announcement in the Cape Argus, but Val had no ring, so I don't know what she wore, some other ring, or my mother gave her a ring or something. So that was the story. Anyway, then I went to Bulawayo. And I'd never been on an airplane before, So I got on the plane at Cape Town Airport. In those days, the company used to send their executives out to wave you goodbye. And Goldschmidt or Gerber, Samson were there. And I went to Bulawayo, it's about 1,500 miles away, and worked with Wallerstein for a few days. It was different work to what I'd been doing, because he was dealing mainly with there were many factories in Bulawayo in those days, and they all needed raw materials. There were a lot of clothing factories, mainly owned by Jewish families. And there was other factories as well. They'd formed a federation. The British had formed a federation of the Rhodesias, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, Nyasaland. And this was going to be the great democracy and liberal bastion in Africa. Of course, it didn't work. A few years later, it broke up. But in those days, it was regarded as a refuge, in a way, from the increasingly harsh apartheid regime in South Africa. So there were a lot of youngsters leaving South Africa for economic reasons, but also for ideologic reasons. And amongst those were many Jewish boys and girls. So anyway, I arrived in Bulawayo, and I worked there for a few months, and learned all about textiles and yarn and fiber, and I dealt with a bank there, and I did learn a lot. When Wallerstein came back, they didn't know what to do with me. So they said, well, look, why don't you stay on in Bulawayo? We've already replaced you in Cape Town. Stay on in Bulawayo as Wallerstein's assistant, which I did. I really didn't have too many options. So a couple of months later, I went back to Cape Town, and Val and I moved up to Bloemfontein, and there we got married on the 1st of January 1956, nearly 60 years. What was interesting, the government in South Africa had determined long before that blacks and whites could not marry. There was no intermarriage. But they'd introduced a new law which took hold on the 1st of January 1956. It was a Sunday. So we were the first people, at least in Bloemfontein, to get married on that day because the government offices were closed and so on. So we had to provide birth certificates. Birth certificates showed your race in South Africa. We had to prove not only that we were both white, but that our parents and our grandparents were all white. That was what things had come to in South Africa. So we got married. By that time, I had a company car, an old Vauxhall General Motors car made in England, and we traveled from Bloemfontein through Johannesburg up to Rhodesia, to the eastern part of Rhodesia, to Inyanga. Inyanga was a verdant mountain area, and it was much cooler than the rest of the country. And there was a lot of recreation there. There was trout fishing in the streams. There was, of course, golf, tennis, and walks. So we went to a hotel they called the Dana K Hotel. And that's where our honeymoon took place. And after a little time there, we got into our Vauxhall and we drove back to Bulawayo. It was quite a long trip. I suppose we must have done 1,500 miles at least. And when we got to Bulawayo, we stayed at a hotel for a few days, and we then rented an apartment. I was earning a little more money there, and Val was very luckily able to get a job at the Bulawayo Hebrew Nursery School. We lived very happily in Bulawayo. The only thing I wasn't so happy about was that my relationship with Wallerstein wasn't excellent. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't excellent. And I'd been running the office in his absence, and now I was the second guy on the totem pole. So in the meantime, we made some friends there, including Werner and Liesel Kame, who became lifelong friends. And we joined a Jewish sports club, Parkview, and we played tennis there. And we had a few other friends. And the time came when Claude Levy, who was running the office in Salisbury, he somehow always seems to be somewhere in my life, or at least in those years, he decided he was going to go into business on his own. So he went into business on his own, in the dress business, in manufacturing dresses, married a wealthy girl, and they needed somebody to run the Salisbury office. I was there. So I left Wallerstein. We went up to Salisbury. This was 1957, end of 1957, I think. And we got a small apartment, a double-story apartment, and it was a bit tight, especially after our son was born. Michael was born in that apartment and raised there for a year or so. In the meantime, I took over the office. Their office was also very, very small. the business there consisted of, similar to the Bulawayo business, supplying fabrics from Japan and so on to clothing factories. Did a lot of business in steel wire and steel fencing, which was imported in those days. Steel products, steel bars and sheet, and there was yarn and fiber, which was imported for some of the mills there. Then we imported timber from America, from South Africa, for construction purposes. And I was also responsible for the business in the other parts of the Federation. That meant Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland. Ultimately, Northern Rhodesia became Zambia, and Nyasaland became Malawi. So I used to travel quite a lot to these countries, and then I started traveling overseas, particularly to Japan. From about 1960 onwards, I went to Japan at least once a year, and there were trips to Europe, so I did a lot of traveling. Living in Salisbury was a wonderful place for making friends. We had all these fellow South Africans who I mentioned were in a similar position to us. Soon after we arrived in Salisbury, we linked up with a distant cousin of mine, Flora Adwin. She was married to Saul Adwin. And Saul was somewhat older. He was 10 years older than I was. And Flora was a few years older. And they lived in the Highlands area of Salisbury, which was a little distant out of town. They had a large property and a swimming pool. And when our son was born, Michael, it was a wonderful thing to be able to go out there. We were living in apartments. To go out there and use the swimming pool, and they had 3 boys and a girl, and one of the boys, Dennis, was about the same age as Michael, and there was tremendous friendship. And Saul was then, when we first met him, he was standing to be a member of parliament. It was still the Federation of the Rhodesias and Nyasaland, and Walensky, Sir Roy Walensky, was the Prime Minister. So Saul was standing to get into Parliament, to become a member of Parliament, and a number of us who were friends of his helped him as volunteers in the campaign, and sure enough, he got in. And that preoccupied him for a few years, and then the Federation broke up, and that was a whole different political situation. But we visited the Adwins almost every weekend, I would say, for a long time. And then they moved closer into the town. But in the meantime, I became involved with Saul in discussions on business issues and all kinds of situations. We would sit together for hours talking about business activities, talking about the political situation in the country. We all read a lot. And we would discuss books together. We would discuss Time magazine, which we all read from cover to cover, and what was happening in the world, what was happening in Israel. And he was a very dynamic guy, very magnetic personality, and he could take very bold decisions, unlike myself, who tended to be very cautious. So I felt very comfortable with him. And I think he felt very comfortable with me, and he liked the fact that I had this sort of international perspective through all these overseas offices I was affiliated with and all the traveling that I'd done and so on. And as time went by, we became more and more concerned about the political situation. Some of the states to the north of us had become independent. White governments had turned into black governments. Colonial powers had relinquished to black governments and so on. And these governments were now hospitable to black political movements within Rhodesia who were starting movements to infiltrate, planting landmines, shooting up farms and so on. And had just started. We were all concerned because we realized that we couldn't be immune from all this. We were living a very secure life otherwise, and we were doing pretty well. When the Federation broke up, because the black communities to the north of us in northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland revolted against this white regime, we realized that eventually this would somehow affect us. Our government was very, very right-wing in those days. Ian Smith had supplanted the more liberal governments we'd experienced before that. And he threatened and eventually made good on his threats to declare independence from Britain. So Southern Rhodesia in those days was called a self-governing colony. That meant everything it did on its own except for foreign affairs. And Smith his rallying cry was, if all these African states who are more backward get their own self-government, why should we not? And he declared independence on November 11, 1965. That was a turning point, and we kind of looked into the abyss. We didn't know what would happen. The whole world declared sanctions against us. We didn't know what would happen. We thought all trade might stop because they weren't supposed to buy or sell to us. Anyway, that eventually proved a great opportunity for our company because it crippled a lot of other firms, but we were able to finesse the situation and actually do well out of the conditions which arose. But if these conditions which pertain to the north of us took over in Rhodesia, what would we do and where would we go? Another problem was we could go to South Africa. Some of the Jewish community turned towards Israel. It was hard to get into more distant countries. The States was very difficult. England was easier and Australia was easier. But how did you move your money out? Because even if you had some money, it was illegal to move it out. And you were only given a small allowance. And there were draconian government measures, if you tried to subvert the system and move your money illegally. So some people, of course, were in a better position than others. Working for an international company, I was a little bit better off because I was able to get a little bit of small amounts of money legally paid to me overseas by our company in Europe, in Switzerland. They kept some money there for me, but most people weren't in that position. But it did give us a little bit of a nest egg overseas. So we're in a better position than most. We acquired motor companies, we acquired a furniture factory, we acquired all kinds of things, and some of them worked and many of them didn't. We were living in a country which was sanctioned, meaning Britain, Japan, France, all the United Nations would not buy or sell to us. However, although Britain and America held strongly to the sanctions, some of the other countries winked at it. So we were really doing pretty well, but nagging at us all this time were these issues of where we would settle. We didn't really want to go back to South Africa. We thought that was one step better than Rhodesia, but really not a solution. Anyway, I had a good relationship. I'd met the management of the New York office on a few occasions, and we had talked about my coming to the States. But in 1974, Saul had fallen ill. He had developed a sarcoma, a form of cancer, and it moved very, very rapidly. And in April 1975, he passed away. It was a terrible, terrible blow to his family, of course, but also to me. I was terribly badly affected by this. I had a very, very close relationship with him. And at about this time, one of the people in New York, Charles Stern, who was the president of the company at the time, said to me, look, we bought a company, Hamos Company, but it's not going very well, and wouldn't you come over and manage it? So Val and I went to New York to have a look around, because she'd never been to America before, and we were very well received here, and we went to see an immigration. We accepted. We discussed it, and we accepted very quickly, and saw an immigration lawyer, and he said, look, we'll try and prove that this is an inter-office transferee situation. So within a couple of months, I had a visa. Now, our children, we had 3 children, oldest to youngest. Michael was 17. At the end of the year, he was due to go to the military. There was conscription. Any school leaver aged 17 or more had to go into the military, and that was a fearsome thought, because a lot of kids then were finding action in the bush. Particularly, there were a lot of landmines being laid, and people were coming back maimed, losing limbs and so on. And we knew that war was unwinnable in the long term. So we had to get him out, either send him out on his own, as some families did, or immigrate. And that immigration was the way to go. So Michael, of course, when he heard we were going to America, he was delighted. It was a huge adventure. It got him off the hook from the military. Some of his friends who were a year older than him or so had been sent out to Israel on their own, and their parents had remained behind in Rhodesia. It wasn't a good situation for these kids. So he was delighted. Debbie, on the other hand, was a few years younger, and she was very, very close to Val, but she didn't understand why we had to leave. Life was wonderful for these kids. Elizabeth was somewhat younger. She really didn't understand. She wasn't old enough to appreciate what was going on, and as long as she had Val with her, she was all right, I think. In Rhodesia, I was as good a father as I thought I could be, but I had a lot of distractions. First of all, I put in tremendous hours at work, and I was frequently traveling in Africa and also overseas. I had very long overseas trips sometimes 3-4 weeks at a time, and several a year. So my attention to family was not as good as it should have been. On the other hand, I wasn't a golfer, as many of my friends were. I did play tennis, but I wasn't a golfer. So I was able to spend a lot of time, particularly with Michael. I used to watch him playing rugby, and frequently Saul and I would go on our bicycles to the rugby field and watch the boys play. Dennis in one team, Michael in another, and so we were very attached. The girls Val really took care of the girls. I didn't have a very strong influence on their upbringing, but Val was with them constantly. We also, of course, had a nanny. We had a cook, we had a garden boy, a gardener. They all lived on the premises, and so we were. And this was standard. And this was standard in Rhodesia for white families, even middle-class families. They earned monthly salaries. They got full board lodging and uniforms, but we didn't pay them very much. That was the system. When we left, we bought a house in one of the African townships for the nanny who'd been with us for a long, long time, Rachel Chiguida, and we settled her in this house and sent her I kept some money in Rhodesia. I had no option. I had money in Rhodesia, and the office there dispersed it to her every month. She had an allowance, so she was able to live. And we visited her a couple of times in years later. Val, at that stage, spent most of her time with the kids. She was playing bridge. She was doing some other volunteer work, but she spent most of her time with the children. I, on the other hand, as I mentioned, was a little bit distracted by business and by traveling. One of our close associations, if you like, in Rhodesia was the fact that my brother, David, had settled there. He was a physician. He was married to a girl from Salisbury, Herzliya Buchman. And Val and Hertzie were very close. David and I would see each other regularly. We would have lunch together every Friday. And soon after we left, they went to live in South Africa. They stayed there a few years and then settled in America, in Great Neck, in fact. And he worked in the city, ending up at Beth Israel Hospital as a gastroenterologist. There was also a younger brother, 12 years younger than I, Jonathan. He'd been born in 1944, and he'd also become a doctor and also a gastroenterologist. In fact, he had his training at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, but had to go back to South Africa for visa reasons. And ultimately, the Mayo offered him a full-time consultancy, and he was there. Well, he still is there many, many years later. He has a son who lives there and a couple of grandchildren. The Jewish community, where I was quite active, had opened a school, a junior school, Sharon School. And there were mainly Jewish kids there, but not only Jewish kids. They had Hebrew, a lot of Hebrew, and our two children, and Elizabeth, the three children, went to Sharon School right through their junior school years, and so did most of our friends' children. So very close associations were formed. I was somewhat active in the shul, and eventually became the chairman of the Salisbury Hebrew congregation. There was also a gabbai who attended to the religious affairs, but I handled the administration of the shul for a while and had to deal with the rabbi and staff and so on, and it was quite an interesting experience, most of it positive. And I was encouraged in all this by my friend Werner Kame, who had been the previous chairman. Over the years, we had fantastic holidays. Every April, I think it was, we used to go down to Beira, and we used to drive down there. It was about, I think it was about 300 miles, a little over 300 miles. We used to get into the car and drive through Umtali on the eastern part of Rhodesia, go through the customs into Portuguese territory, where the roads were disheveled and compared to Rhodesia, which was very well manicured and well kept. And we used to get to Beira, and there was a kind of holiday, there were holiday apartments. And we stayed there for many, many years. And we often were there at the same time as friends, particularly the Hodises. David and Hertzie often were with us. On one occasion, we shared a house there, rented a house, and shared it with David and Hertzie. So we had fantastic, they were beautiful beaches, the prawns, the shrimps, were plentiful, very inexpensive, and we had marvelous meals, lots of cheap wine, and we have a lot of movies of those years. Very, very carefree. On the way down to Beira, a few times we stopped at a game park in Mozambique territory called Gorongosa. Gorongosa was a little primitive, but they had an enormous amount of game, and it was totally unspoilt. To get there, you had to put your car onto a pontoon, and Africans would push you across the river on this floating platform, this pontoon, to get you to the other side. There were innumerable lions, elephants, hippos, all kinds of game, and giraffe, of course. So those were wonderful trips. We also went to other game parks. We went to Wankie, which is near the Victoria Falls, and we visited the Victoria Falls as well. So we saw quite a lot of African game. We've tried as best we could to give our children excellent education. We were generous to our children in every way, and I think they appreciate that and reciprocate now. So we look back with Val and I with great pride on our children and our grandchildren, and I think they have had the best education they could absorb. I look back at life and I think that I've had a I had a very interesting life, a loving family, a wonderful business career, a lot of traveling, and a tremendous life partner.